Hi, everybody. It's Mrs. Verellen. I'm going to talk to you guys this week about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was something that really started to get organized and take a significant or started a significant impact in the United States in the 1950s, and then it travels through into the 1960s into the 1970s. So I have two different sets of notes that we're going to talk about today. The first one's just going to be about the 1950s. So, as you guys can see, the first thing I usually talk about is how certain barriers started to get broken. And one of those was obviously in sports. And professional sports are something that have been around since the turn of the century. And they did not allow for African Americans to participate in professional sports before this. And so Jackie Robinson was one of the first to be allowed to participate. He was a player in the Negro Leagues first, and he was recruited by the Dodgers. Their manager, as you guys can see here, Branch Rickey, was one who recruited him, and he faced a lot of discrimination when he played. There were other teams that refused to play him. There were audience members who would throw things at him while he was there, and there's great movies out there for you guys to watch if you're interested on this. They've done a couple in the past for him and what he did for the league, and obviously for a lot of athletes and African Americans in professional sports. Another huge thing that marks the 1950s is the court case of, as you guys can see, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas is what it technically is. It happened in 1951, where this little girl, Oliver Brown is the pastor up in the left-hand corner here. His little daughter, who's on the bottom there, was traveling a ridiculous distance to go to elementary school, when there was a elementary school that was like 2 blocks from their house. And he said, why does my daughter have to go to the one that's, miles upon miles away when she could go to the one that's really close to our house? Well, obviously the one close to their house was a white school, and so she wasn't allowed to go there. So he challenged this. He said that's against her constitutional rights. And so he's sued the school board. Thurgood Marshall was a very important person. You're going to hear about him more later on. He was the one who defended Oliver Brown and his daughter. It went all the way, got appealed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a very big ruling here when they said that separate but equal, which was something that was established with Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1800s, was actually unequal and unconstitutional. Basically saying, no, you can't do that anymore. All schools had to be integrated. They could no longer be segregated, because we knew that segregation was not equal. The black schools were much worse off than the white schools were. They had leftover books. They had horrible desks, if they even had desks. And so it was not equal like it was supposed to be. So that was one of the main rulings that happened in the 1950s that really started shaking things up. And people were obviously upset about this. People were scared. And then how would this integration look? And it was pretty chaotic in the beginning. This also happened right around the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. This happened in Montgomery, Alabama, where you guys know the story of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks had been riding on the bus, and this is one interesting thing. She was actually in the African-American section. It was a crowded bus, and she refused to move from her seat because she was sitting where she was legally supposed to sit. And I usually show you guys a really good video. I'll see if I can get a clip of it, where the bus driver said, you need to move. And she said, no, I'm not going to. And he's like, well, I'm going to call the cops. And she's like, okay, fine. You may do that. I'm not moving. So in congruence with this, there was a huge, over a year, I think it was like 380 days, that the African Americans in Montgomery refused to ride the bus system. And this really affected the bus system because they were the ones that usually rode the bus. And so they organized through their churches and organizations massive carpools to get people where they needed to go, and basically said, we're not going to do this unless you integrate the bus system too. So it took another year, but then the Supreme Court ruled that the Brown versus Board ruling also applied to city transportation. Obviously, people were not happy with this. So you can have the Little Rock, Arkansas governor said no, and he said, I'm not integrating the schools. So President Eisenhower had to send in the National Guard to force integration. And that's where, you can see there's a very famous picture of 9 students, African-American students, trying to go into a school, and they were berated while they did so. Last but not least here, you had not just African Americans, you had Mexican Americans and Native Americans that also had civil rights violations at the